Hello and welcome to what I hope will be the most interesting half hour of your working week. My name is Jan Schwartz and I lead the B2B Institute, a think tank funded by LinkedIn that studies the future of B2B decision making and B2B marketing. We are very excited to present you our collaboration with Rory Sutherland today. Here's a question for you. What do you do when life gives you lemons? Rory's answer is very simple. You slice them very thinly and you drop them in a gin and tonic. That's maybe not the answer you were expecting, but it's exactly the point of our talk today. Let's face it, we live in very strange times. People are worried about the future. Marketers are worried about their jobs, about their budgets. That's understandable. But we are here to tell you that there's opportunity if you can muster the courage to think more laterally and come up with ideas that seem a little strange at first. We need you to put down your spreadsheets and think bigger and rediscover that marketing is not a cost center, it's a mindset. And here's the good news. None of this requires extra budgets. Like the best things in life, great ideas are free. You just need the courage to let go of self-limiting beliefs and escape the objectivity trap. So let's get into what that means. Here's my colleague Victoria Pattinson to tell you what today's session is all about.
Hi everyone, I'm Victoria Pattinson and I lead the B2B Institute in Europe. Thank you for joining us at this special broadcast. I hope you have a drink or a cup of tea with you for this unusual Friday time slot. For many years, I've worked on and off with today's esteemed guest, Rory Sutherland. Rory is, quite simply, one of the smartest and most intellectually generous people I've ever met. Not just with his knowledge, but also his relish for solving other people's business problems through the lens of behavioural science and creativity. Jan, who you just heard from, and I were thrilled last year when Rory agreed to write his first full-length paper on B2B marketing and behavioural science for our new think tank, LinkedIn, which is now known as the B2B Institute, and we are even more happy to share it with you today. I really hope you enjoy reading Rory's paper, The Objectivity Trap. You can download it for free on our website, which is b2binstitute.org. When we first started working on this project back in those halcyon pre-COVID days, we had no idea where we were heading. Today, so many players in the economy are suffering greatly, and many existing ways of doing business aren't working as they were before. It is a tough time, and many of us are looking for new ways to do things differently, and we hope you find inspiration in Rory's work. There are so many gems in the paper, from how not to become rational the moment you put on a suit, to psychological monopolies being the only legal ones you can pursue in business, to the madness of how groups think, and how we should frame marketing as a mindset that doesn't always require large investment. But before we get started, a couple of practical points. Firstly, our agenda for today. Rory will speak for about 25 minutes, then my fantastic colleague Jenny Shaw-Sweet and Rory's colleague Sam Tatum will summarise some of the key points and say thank yous up front. We're doing this to maximise time for questions, but please do stay on the line for drinks and chat with Rory. He'll answer your questions and your business challenges, and Rory's colleague Kimberly Richter will manage the chat, so thanks Kimberly for doing that. If you do have questions, please make sure you pop them in the Q&A function while Rory speaks. Secondly, if you're looking for the paper, you can find it at b2binstitute.org. The session is being recorded and we will also post it on our website and on the B2B Institute at LinkedIn page on Monday. Lastly, let us know what you think. We're on Twitter at B2B Institute and of course on LinkedIn, and you can email us at, you guessed it, b2binstitute@linkedin.com. Over to you, Rory.
My name is Rory Sutherland. I'm the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy in the UK, and I'm also the founder of something called the Ogilvy Behavioural Science Practice. And what behavioural science aims to do is to both explain, understand, and better respond to questions in business decision-making, in economics, indeed in government and public policy, through a better understanding of human psychology. And we would aver that quite a lot of mistakes have been made in decision-making through leaving psychology out of the equation. And we think that conventional economics is particularly guilty of this. It effectively assumes that people have perfect knowledge of their own preferences. It assumes they know exactly what they want. They know exactly how much they're prepared to pay for something, and they completely trust the person who's selling it to them. Now, the problem with this is that economics does it because it enables them to simplify the mathematics around human decision-making and behaviour. The problem is that the trade-off you make by ignoring human psychology probably blinds you to an enormous number of potential solutions and interventions which would be possible if only you considered how people feel, think, decide and act, rather than using a kind of economic theoretical agent to take the place of real human beings. So just to give a couple of examples from the consumer space, if Nestlé had been completely rational, they would never have launched Nespresso. They would have looked at their data and said, well, there's no evidence that people are prepared to pay 50, 60 pence, 60 or 70 cents for a cup of coffee consumed at home. Everything we know about what people pay for coffee at home tells us that there is no available space there. Yet when you create the Nespresso machine and you pay by the pod, not by the packet, our perception of price completely changes. And that's because the frame of reference perhaps is no longer Nescafe or Illy. Instead, it's Starbucks. And so what might seem expensive in one context or in one set of comparison can seem cheap in another. Uber, in fact, plenty of billion-dollar ideas, including Amazon Prime, I'd include Uber in that, I'd include Red Bull, make no conventional logical sense when viewed through the mind of an economist or through the eyes of a market researcher. People would claim not to be remotely interested in a drink that doesn't taste conventionally very nice. And yet when we look at the actual business success, we start to see the potential opportunity cost that comes if you ignore psychological factors in the innovations, the new products you launch, or the way you promote them. Now, conventionally, this is a discipline which is mostly applied to B2C activities. We've come to a very interesting conclusion, which is that the very same insights that can inform and illuminate B2C decision-making through behavioural science can be perhaps even more applicable in understanding B2B decisions. And we think there are several reasons why behavioural science has been grossly overlooked and undervalued in the B2B community. And in this talk, what we'll do is we'll describe some of them. So I'm particularly grateful here to LinkedIn for founding the B2B Institute. I think for far too long, particularly in marketing, B2B has been viewed as the kind of stepchild of consumer marketing. And we think not only is this a mistake, in fact, we think that B2B is ripe for even more marketing and behavioural attention than B2C is. And so through our research, which is in partnership with LinkedIn's B2B Institute, we expose the conclusion that B2B in many ways is even more emotional than B2C. And I'm here to tell you today why behavioural science in marketing, why it matters so much, and why especially it matters in the area where it's most overlooked, which is in business-to-business activity. B2B accounts for about 50% of the economy. Nearly 40% of UK companies derive all or the vast majority of their income from B2B activity. A further 42% on top of that 40% are hybrids, with some of their income coming from both B2B and B2C. And while it's impossible for us to know and completely separate the exact size of value of B2B internationally, we do know that it accounts for 44% or 1.7 trillion of Britain's business turnover, and about 21 billion in corporate tax. Over 50% of UK FTSE 350 firms are pure B2B businesses. And unlike B2C, we in Britain actually have a global trade surplus on our B2B activity. Now, what's going on here? Well, first of all, when people think of businesses, most people are consumers, so unsurprisingly, they're more likely to think of a Unilever or a soap manufacturer than they are to think about someone who produces industrial pumping equipment. That's part of it. When it comes to marketing, of course, B2C marketing is hugely visible, whereas a lot of B2B marketing isn't. But we also think there's another prevailing problem which is much more severe, which is what you might call the myth of rationality. which is that we all like to maintain the pretense that the second anybody sits behind a desk or puts on a suit, they immediately lose all their behavioural biases, they park their emotions in the car park, and they sit there making entirely rational decisions like a conventionally rational economic agent, free of any kind of emotional or perceptual influence. And the simple thing is, you don't become rational the moment you put on a suit. If business people are really that rational, why do they play so much golf? So the reason I think we need a completely new map, as I call it, for B2B, is because this very standard myth of the entirely rational actor has become ludicrously over-prevalent in making decisions relating to B2B. In many ways, one of the things we've discovered is institutional settings create more behavioural bias than you find in individual decision making. Because in many cases, the need to defend and justify and explain your decision, in many cases in B2B, outweighs the importance of actually making a good decision. Fear of blame is a more potent force than fear of regret, if you like. And so what happens is this assumption of complete rationality, as though because someone's wearing a suit and sitting in a business meeting, they act exactly like the homo economicus of economic models, where they're only interested in the kind of things that, economists and highly rational entities like management consultancies would consider important. The only way you can improve something is by improving the efficiency of manufacture, lowering the price, or indeed objectively improving the product. What's completely overlooked in that model is that by simply telling a different story about something, presenting it in a different context or a different light, or indeed pricing in a completely new and different way, can actually add value to the relationship just as much as objective improvements can. And so this objective map is a problem because it's very beguiling, because it helps us make sense of the world. Unfortunately, it helps us make sense of the world in a way that isn't wholly accurate. Moreover, when everybody uses the same map, it creates the opportunity for someone to establish a kind of mental monopoly by looking at a different kind of map or by prioritizing different things. And so the reason I use this map analogy all the time is by analogy with the London Tube map. It's a wonderful way of understanding the interconnectedness of London tube lines. It was designed by an electrical engineer, Harry Beck, who used wiring diagrams as his inspiration. The only problem is what starts off by being a useful mental aid ends up as a kind of mental prison. After a time, the map stops being useful and starts defining your very impression of London. And if your idea of London is constrained purely to what happens to appear on the tube map, there will be whole dark areas about which you know nothing at all, which you therefore ridiculously ignore. And we argue that actually it's in those areas that are covered by your map and nobody else's that you genuinely find economic value. There's a very simple and important point about marketing, which I think tends to mean that marketing gets dangerously overlooked in B2B. And that's because people have started to conflate marketing with marcoms. And because as a proportion of overall spend, B2B will tend to spend less on comms than you find in B2C. What that means is that marketers are less often represented at board level, that the people who are making business decisions have often spent no time at all working in marketing. And as a result, the loss is that you lose a particular frame of reference or mindset that you find in marketers that you tend not to find in everybody else. Most people in business, if you're in logistics, for example, if you're in most areas of business activity, you see your job as a kind of optimization problem. You look at the world with the eyes of a system controller, and you essentially also look at the world through averages. Most of the data you receive is an amalgamation. It's an aggregate of lots and lots of individual decisions, and you seek to read reality by looking at essentially aggregate average information. What makes a marketer different and what makes their viewpoint uniquely valuable is that a marketer instinctively and through practice tends to look at the world through a customer's eye view. So they will not ask the question, okay, what does this product or service look like in terms of increasing or decreasing sales? They will actually look at an individual customer's experience of the world over time. Now, you might argue that, for example, Amazon Prime is an example of a marketing mindset. What Bezos suddenly realized is that whereas 10 people don't mind paying £3 once a month to pay for delivery, one person isn't going to like paying £3 10 times a month. And therefore, if you want to have frequent customers, you have to solve this problem. Another example of a marketing mindset is understanding whether something sounds expensive or whether it sounds cheap. Now, you can entirely change perception of how expensive something is by choosing a different frame of reference. Now, I would argue that procurement play this trick all the time. What they do is they add up the sum total of what you spend, of what their company spends with you, and they more or less suggest that you should reduce this by 10%. It's in a way, it's a way of looking at the world that drives you towards cost cutting. On the other hand, there are ways you can price which make something relatively expensive seem very cheap. And one of my favourite examples is of a company which operates solely in providing legal services to transport companies. And the way they frame the pricing of this is, we cost you 20 pence per vehicle per day. Now, framed against the as-new cost of a bus, 20 pence is basically trivial. You see that as a rounding error. It's not something you should be concerned by. He does something even more ingenious, which is every time he speaks at a conference, he leaves small coins under people's chairs and says, and you've got your first day's legal cover for free, because people can root under their chair and find 20 or 30 pence there. Now, the point is, in selling Lucky Charms or breakfast cereal, people probably recognise that, these psychological factors matter. In B2B, where they're used only to looking at aggregate business data, not experiential data, this kind of angle gets completely overlooked. The bad news is that I think a lot of mistakes are made because no one has access to the marketing viewpoint. The good news, on the other hand, is there are spectacular opportunities to be had for those few companies who do. So when we look at institutional decision-making, one of the things that surprised me is that biases in making a decision in an institution are almost certainly stronger than when making consumer decisions. When consumers make a decision, they're allowed to factor in a lot of things, what you might call unconscious second-order information, like brand quality, for example, into their decision. What they're trying to do is to avoid making a decision they'll subsequently regret. Now, the difference is in institutional decision-making, in many ways, the quality of your justification of your decision is more important to you than the quality of the outcome. Because there are huge asymmetries in terms of making a good or bad decision as to whether it appears to be rational or whether it appears not to be. So broadly speaking, if you make an irrational, ill-defended decision and things go wrong, you lose your job. If you make a rational decision which goes wrong, you generally keep your job and blame falls somewhere else. And so once you look at it through the lens of what Gerd Gigerenzer calls defensive decision-making, essentially, it's through the lens of blame aversion. What you understand is that, well, exactly what's summed up in the greatest B2B line of all time, IBM's "No one ever got fired for buying IBM." Because what's going on there is that the outcomes are massively asymmetrical. If you do particularly well, you might get a little bit of a reward or a promotion or a bonus. If you make a mistake, you lose your job. So there's a huge asymmetry there in terms of the consequences. And so what this leads people to do is to make decisions that are the least likely to incur negative consequences for them, rather than making the decisions that are best for the organisation. And you might argue that a huge amount of the activity that goes on within businesses is, in a sense, arse-covering disguised as rigour. In other words, the more lengthy the process you go through to arrive at a decision, and the more people you involve, the less likely it is that blame's going to fall squarely on you. Now, when you immediately start saying to this, well, that's true of other companies, but obviously not true of my own, be careful. This bias is found much more widely than just in businesses. You also find it, for example, in medicine, where doctors are much happier referring someone to a consultant for exploratory surgery than leaving them to get better on their own, even though the statistics may say no intervention is probably the best bet. Why do they do this? Because you can get sued for doing nothing, but it won't be you who gets sued if you do something. And so large areas of activity, in many cases either economically useless or in some cases deleterious, quite often go on within businesses essentially to shore up the career of the decision maker rather than to actually pursue what's economically best for the organization as a whole. I think some of the problems we've talked about here aren't confined to B2B companies. I think they're common in any company which has a very strong engineering or financial or economic mindset. Tech companies are also guilty of this, because in the technical world, it's normally absolutely clear what problem you have to solve. The metrics that are available to you are the metrics that really matter. And therefore, if you're seeking to make a car faster, the task is clear and the engineering challenge can be neatly broken down. The problem with psychological challenges is they ain't so neat, because in psychological challenges, in marketing challenges, the metrics aren't decided by you or by the laws of physics. They're actually decided by the customer. And so it's vitally important, I think, if you have kind of a train company, people will obsess about things like punctuality and speed, which may or may not be what customers really care about. Customers may, to be honest, at least in the light of experience, vastly prefer a 40-minute train journey where there's a seat-back table and a good Wi-Fi signal to a 30-minute journey where they can't use their laptop and there's no connectivity. So what matters changes according to the whims of customers. It's made more complicated still because one of the most important lessons of behavioural science is that people don't fully know what they themselves want. We don't have introspective access into our needs and wants to the extent that we believe. So in many cases, you can't rely on economic logic to tell you what to do, but you can't rely on customers to tell you what to do because they don't completely know. Most people will say, I don't like waiting a long time for a cab. They won't say, I wish there were a map that reduced my degree of uncertainty about the wait. But in psychological terms, reducing the uncertainty is more important than reducing the duration. That's my point about this. Now, in any organization where sales tend to dominate marketing, the metric will be leads. And if you become obsessed with only doing things you can measure, and only doing things the efficacy of which you can prove and quantify in advance, it makes you look like a very scientific organization. But that very same reductionist thinking is also hugely limiting when it comes to solving problems. Many marketing activities, I would argue, are probabilistic rather than reductionist. In other words, you do things because being famous massively increases the likely opportunity that you'll be presented with. People will come to you with new ideas. People will return your chief executive's phone calls. People will want to work for you more. People will work for you for less money because you're a famous company to put on your CV. Now, it's generally impossible to predict these effects in advance, and in many cases, it's impossible to measure them in retrospect. But the problem is, if you can only do the things the efficacy of which you can predict and measure, it limits your course of action to a very, very limited range of activities, which is you end up doing what you can prove, not doing what works. Not investing in fame is a cost. Being obscure brings enormous opportunity costs, but they're opportunity costs that you can't really quantify. In fact, there's a brilliant LinkedIn article written by a LinkedIn employee called Quantum Marketing, which makes exactly this same point. Now, I think my teenage kids understand fame instinctively better than many professional marketers do, which is the reason they go to parties is not because they have a specific strategy for each party they attend, or because they've done a cost-benefit analysis beforehand. They simply know that if you don't actually make yourself known, fortunate things never happen to you. What could happen when you go to a party is the payoff could be romantic, it could be sexual, it could be you get invited to another better party, you might get invited on holiday, you might discover some interesting gossip about jobs that are suddenly available. You don't know in advance. Indeed, attending a trade fair in the days where trade fairs existed was a very similar thing. You went along in the hope that something good would happen, but also in the instinctive knowledge that if you weren't there, nothing good would ever happen. And what my daughters understand is if you stay home on Saturday night, there's no positive upside to be had. Now, I would argue when we look at marketing, we need to look at the opportunity cost of not doing it much more rigorously and spend less time obsessing about the measurable benefits to doing it. It isn't necessarily possible to predict the advantages of fame in advance or to put a dollar value on what it's worth, partly because many of the benefits that accrue through fame will never be directly attributable. If you're the chief executive of a famous company, when you ring someone up, they return your call. Now, that's inordinately valuable in and of itself, but it's not valuable in a quantifiable way. And I think there's a danger that in our obsession with only doing those things we can measure, we limit ourselves to perhaps 10% of the value that marketing can bring. There's a wonderful phrase in business which is what gets measured gets managed, but there's also a concomitant phrase to that, which is what gets mismeasured gets mismanaged. And I think in many cases the things we're failing to measure things which are impossible to measure are in danger of creating enormous blind spots in business activity. One of the huge values, as I said, that B2B practitioners can bring is simply by using a different map, looking at behavioural questions and questions of perception rather than the questions of objective reality. And the really vital thing you can do by achieving this is differentiate yourself. If all your competitors are making rational decisions based on the assumption of a completely rational consumer, what they're doing is they're becoming more and more alike because they're looking at exactly the same data and making exactly the same assumptions with it. There's not much money to be made in commoditizing yourself because your life will always be a battle with your cheapest and most desperate competitor. What you can do psychologically is you can differentiate yourself. And you can do that by looking at things through the customer's eye view, not through the balance sheet eye view. It's the very messiness of marketing which in a way makes it a valuable place to look. Because there's a lot of uncertainty there, there's a degree of probabilisticness to what you do, but it's the very uncertainty that makes it an unpopular place for all your competitors to look. That's one way in which you can actually sell yourself in a completely different way to everybody else, by looking at psychological innovation, what we call innovation, rather than technical innovation. The great problem with technical innovation is a good technological innovation can be copied in months, but a psychological one actually endures. It's how a product or service makes you feel is a much more long-lasting effect on human behaviour than what its objective attributes are. You know, we act according to our feelings, not according to data. And feelings around a brand simply endure longer and are longer lasting and more lucrative, and in many cases vastly cheaper to produce than simple improvements in specifications or objective reality. And so one of the things we'd say is that there's always a huge opportunity for innovation in psychology, even when innovation in technology becomes really, really different. The same thing presented in a different way, with a different story attached or a different frame of comparison, effectively, as far as humans perceive it, is a different thing. Once you understand some of the biases that are present in collective decision making, that in many ways we care more about what we think, what other people think of our decisions, than we care about the quality of our decisions or the outcomes. Once you understand loss aversion and some of the other biases that are prevalent in decision making, what it does is it provides you with a completely new way of looking at the world. And a completely new way of looking at the world is generally the best way to innovate.
That was great. Thank you so much, Rory, and thank you also for generously sharing the thinking that feels so relevant right now, especially as we look at behaviour and also psychology in business. I also want to thank the fantastic team at Ogilvy Consulting, Sam and Kimberly and Anna, who've also worked closely with us on the paper, as well as John, Nick and Christopher, who've hosted so graciously on the Ogilvy page today. Rory is also launching a newsletter on LinkedIn, and I understand it will go live on Monday. So I really recommend to you following that, as it's going to be super smart as well as really entertaining. We're also just going to give the team a little time to mind the chat and look through the Q&A for a short list of questions for Rory in a few minutes, so that we have so we can give the maximum time rather than interrupting Rory. So I'd rather get his Q&A session running to the end of time rather than interrupting him at the end. So I'm going to remind you now that the paper is available for you to download from the B2B Institute website or our page on LinkedIn, and that's much easier. It's just a couple of clicks. I should also let you know that our next event will be on the 13th of August with Marketing to the CFO. I'd personally like to thank the whole B2B Institute team who've worked with me on this paper: Jan, Victoria, John and Peter, Rachel, Afia, Antai and Jamie, for the support we've had also from Mike and Penry at LinkedIn. I feel really grateful to have a job like right now, and let alone one working with such truly lovely people. We've just a few moments until the team are ready. There are a lot of questions and there's been a lot of chat. So I thought you'd like to hear something from Sam, who will be able to give us a little insight from the paper, as it's a rich 56 pages of the good stuff, so well worth downloading. So Sam, on our shared screen, we've summarised some of the key points from what we've been able to squeeze into this webinar. But knowing what you do and in experience that you have with Ogilvy Consulting clients, what is the best next action you'd recommend based on this research for our marketing audience today?
Thanks so much, Jenny, and thanks so much for the team from B2B's, from the LinkedIn B2B Institute for this partnership. I think really the opportunity for us now is to embrace that the marketing is a mindset. As Rory's touched upon, there's a competitive advantage that could be found between the ears. There's sort of latent psychological potential that we can tap into if we know where to look. We can innovate with what exists, with our understanding, rather than creating things that are new. And because of this, I think it's really important for us to consider that you don't need to be a marketer explicitly. We don't need to have a marketing budget. We don't need to always have channels in the traditional sense to embrace this, to embrace psychology with creativity. We're finding for many of our clients within Ogilvy Consulting that actually it's not a classic marketing engagement. Working in sales discussions, working in client experience, I'm looking even at behavioral safety in factories to see how we can start to apply this thinking, ask different questions, and to get to more sort of novel and innovative solutions. And that's something that we think is open for all of us on this session today. And even more importantly, I think, and quite often, certainly in literature and in popular thinking, a lot of behavioral science within a consumer perspective goes to sort of B2C. And as Rory's outlined today, we think there's a vast opportunity to embrace this thinking with a B2B audience. As Rory's mentioned, consumers avoid regret. When we look at B2B, it's a far greater fear of blame. So if we can think about the potency of these drivers from a consumer perspective, we believe they might be even more amplified from a B2B perspective. So what can we do? Well, the first thing, as Jenny and the team have mentioned, download the paper. We can start to embrace some of this vernacular to really open up our world with rich questions, the psychology of loss aversion to lead to brighter solutions. And we can start to lead the charge of applied behavioral science within our organizations, and we don't need to be within a marketing capability or a Marcoms capability by which to do this. So as I said, it's been such a thrill to work on this together, and I'm really sort of honored now to be able to hand over. I'm extremely fortunate to call the following two people, my colleagues, so Kimberly Richter and Rory Sutherland, to respond to some of your questions.
Hi everyone. Sam, thank you so much for that introduction. As mentioned, for those that I haven't met, my name is Kimberly and I work on the Ogilvy Consulting Behavioral Science team with Rory. And it is such a pleasure to be here with you today, all the way from Brazil to Kuala Lumpur. So many of you have chosen to join us on your Friday evening, so thank you for that. I am joined by a man who needs no introduction. Rory, it's so great to be here with you, and congratulations on this brilliant piece of work.
It's a pleasure. I think it's absolutely fascinating because, in a sense, business advantage only lies in finding things that your competitors neglect. And here, I think in B2B marketing, which has always been considered the kind of stepchild of consumer marketing, I think you see this extraordinary opportunity. And I think you see it in everything, not necessarily, I mean, if we can break this conflation with marcoms, which I think is a really dangerous problem. The assumption that because you're perhaps not spending that much on bought media, therefore marketing is less important. And we can get it across that marketing is actually, it's a frame of mind, it's a way of looking at the world. It's a problem-solving toolkit, not a communications toolkit, pure and simple. Then we're halfway there to actually helping businesses exploit this area, which is almost completely terra incognita in many cases. And that really excites me.
Absolutely. And I think that was a large takeaway for me as well, reading this paper. It's a manifesto for marketing and the importance of creativity. Looking at the chat and all of the many questions that we've received, I think in response to that point specifically, Dave Stevens shared with us a really interesting point. So from his perspective, if you're just starting out and building your business marketing from scratch, you need to focus first on the quantifiable benefit of what you're doing. And once you've earned that right, you have space to grow the amount of unquantifiable work. So his question to you, Rory, is creativity only really for mature marketing functions?
It's very interesting because business is unbelievably strict about quantification in some things and unbelievably lax in others. So nobody really, when you attend a trade fair or when you attend a networking event, okay, we accept that that's unquantifiable, don't we? I mean, maybe sometimes you go, if I hadn't gone to that event, I never would have met so-and-so and we never would have won this bit of business. But you go understanding that it's probabilistic. You know, if all you know is if I don't go, nothing good will ever happen to me. If I hide in a hole. And there are other things, by the way, which fascinate me about business where it never bothers to measure. It always struck me as very strange before the pandemic happened that not a single, with the tiny exception of the Ogilvy behavioral science practice, not a single business I knew had conducted any experiments with remote working and video conferencing. Okay. So, you know, if we were genuinely as obsessed with accountability and quantification as we like to pretend, we would at the very least have said, okay, we're going to take 20 employees and we're going to try working differently and we're going to see what improves and what gets worse. Nobody even bothered. They just went on doing exactly the same thing. And so it's worth remembering in business that habit is always safe because behaving habitually never arouses any comment. And if your behavior seems perfectly normal because it's traditional and it's enshrined, someone asked a question, which I think is actually hugely important, about the low pace of adoption of new healthcare innovations. And that's fundamentally a marketing problem. In the same way that the appallingly slow adoption of Zoom by businesses before they were obliged to do it, you know, suddenly, actually, businesses proved themselves amazingly adaptable when they were forced to. But in the 3 years where the technology already existed and was at a high level of, not perfection, but I mean a high level of usability, the very fact that nothing was happening is kind of real. Now, I'm going to tell a very interesting, I'm going to say something outrageous now, because I think it might be true. Okay, now the only guy I know who also believes this is an Italian economist who's written a book which is only in Italian. And I have met him and he speaks a bit of English. He used to be the chief economist of Ferrero Rocher, actually, the people who make the hazelnut-based treats. And his belief is that the pace of economic growth, the thing that now limits the pace of economic growth is not supply or available technology, it's actually psychology, it's the speed of adoption. And he argues that, you know, essentially when you see America typically growing at 2.5% annually GDP, what's imposing that limit? What's imposing that 2.5% limit in the developed world? It can be faster in the developing world because you simply copy what people do somewhere else. Okay. But if you're in the most advanced economy in the world, what's actually slowing your growth is effectively the unwillingness of people to adopt and try new things. And that means that economic growth isn't really an economic problem. It's not a problem of supply. It wasn't as if Zoom didn't exist 3 years ago. It's a problem of adoption, which makes it a marketing challenge. Now, that's a very weird way to look at marketing. Now, if you think about it, there used to be in the 17th century some economists called the French physiocrats. And in 17th century France, of course, if you're an aristocrat or a landowner, you had much higher status than a manufacturer, right? And the French physiocrats designed this kind of status-driven school of economics, which believed that if you actually grew corn on the land, or you grew sheep, or you grew cows, or you quarried stone from land, you were creating economic value, because that came from the sun and from the land. If you bought sheep from the local aristocrat who owned 2,000 acres of sheep farm, and you used the wool to make a hat, in their model of the world, you were exploiting the value created by the sheep owner. Okay. Now, okay, if I say that to you now, everybody's going, these people are crazy, right? But it was unacceptable to them to suggest a school of economics where the manufacturer, say, had more status than the landowner. Now, if you think about the position of an economist now, or the position of a finance director in a company, right? If you start saying that maybe the most important question in economics is now a marketing question, not a question of supply, efficiency, available resources, okay? What that says is that people who now derive their status, like the former chief executive of WPP, who was always, it used to drive me nuts because he was hanging out with economists and he wanted to look like an economist. So he kept talking about the Fed and Janet Yellen and shit like that. And I was going, no. You run and a chief executive of the world's largest marketing services company. You should be talking about the vital and pivotal role that marketing plays in economic growth, not talking about the Fed, right? And so, but if you think about it, it would be an appalling loss of status for all economists and all kind of financial journalists if they suddenly had to spend their time talking about how do we persuade people to buy electric cars, okay, rather than talking about money supply or the bond yield. And there's a great quote by Upton Sinclair, which says that it is difficult to get someone to believe something when his entire salary is dependent on him not believing it. Right. And I think that's a relevant quote here in a funny kind of way, because I don't think my theory and the Italian guy's theory that actually psychology and the pace at which humans can adapt and adopt new technological innovations, I don't think my theory that that's now the constraint, not supply. I mean, if you look at it, Elon has gone from basically zilch to being one of the world's largest car makers in the space of, under a decade. Okay. That's not the constraint anymore. But when you make that the constraint, all the conversations about efficiency. And when you make it all about efficiency, everybody's very comfortable because it's all about cost control and measurement and looking at balance sheets, which is where their skill base lies. Absolutely. I'm interested to know if anybody listening, how mad do you think that theory is? That basically the principal limiting factor on economic growth may well. Bill Gates said something similar. He said the trouble is people don't know how to want the things we can offer them. And out of 100%, what percentage of mad is that? I'd love people just to respond, because it strikes me as a little bit mad, and I work in marketing and I'm conscious that it's self-interested. But I nonetheless think it's a perfectly plausible way of looking at the world, which must be true at least some of the time.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, I often think the potential that a business has to be brilliant is dependent on one thing, which is its ability to do things that its chief financial officer doesn't like. Okay, if you've got a business, jobs must have been absolutely maddening to anybody in finance. Okay, if you've got a business which can still do things which are kind of astonishing, even though they kind of make the CFO have a little bit of sick in his mouth. Okay, whether it's the I always know this lovely case, which is the DoubleTree cookie. When you check in at the DoubleTree, apparently the CFO of DoubleTree has been trying to kill that off for years. And yet miraculously the marketing officer still, apparently to wind up the CFO, she recently made the cookies bigger just to wind him up. But that's the kind of thing. Yeah, and that's a nice comment from Dennis Daly, by the way. It's 100% mad not to at least consider it. And, you know, if the physiocrats can be considered completely sane, going, no, 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 all economic value is created by aristocrats owning farms, then I don't see why our present day conception might not be equally bonkers.
Definitely. And I think this very unprecedented moment is accelerating a lot of shifts in perspectives and mindsets. And I love the idea that it's going to shift the perspective that marketing can help accelerate speed of adoption as well. I wonder, in your very storied career in advertising, has there been a particular example that comes first to mind when you think of provocative, human-centered marketing in B2B?
I have to tell a story which happened after I wrote this paper, which I just love. Talking to one of my colleagues, and it's a brilliant case of psychological price description. Procurement will always add up what you cost, talk about you as if you're a cost. And one of the things I always say to my colleagues is, if you're dealing with Unilever, talk about what the agency costs per item of product sold, i.e. 0.0003p, not in terms of overall cost. And whether they'd listened to me or whether this was coincidence, one of my colleagues had to pitch for a very large satellite communications company, which I probably better not name here, but you might be able to guess. And this company actually launches satellites that are in low Earth orbit in their tens or even hundreds. And when they came to present the agency cost, they said, alternatively, if you'd rather not spend the money on us, with the same amount of money, you could get one of your rockets from the launch pad to 75 feet up in the air. Okay. And they framed the cost against the cost of everything else that business was doing. And suddenly you realize, look, actually, this is a rounding error, guys. And if we're arguing about every single pound here, we're missing the bigger picture. But I mean, the price one is vital, because I think we allow almost all organizations which work B2B, allow people to play this trick of aggregating the cost of something. Now, you know, if you say, my God, it cost £50,000 to design the packaging for this shampoo, people go, oh my goodness, you know, that's half my mortgage. Okay. But if you're selling, you know, 500,000 units of that shampoo, then the cost of the thing per unit compared to the value it has the potential to add. And by the way, packaging can add like 100% or more. Take the perfume industry, okay? Basically packaging with some alcohol in it, okay? It can add, 10,000% to the value of the contents. So it's utterly ridiculous to get that anal about something because you've happened to have framed it in one particular way. Procurement run the numbers and then ask the business who they should choose. That is absolutely true. I've even had cases where the company that wins the business was first on cost and last on every other measure. And the losing business was second on cost and first on every other measure. That is absolutely abominable, by the way. But what is absolutely true, by the way, is that what procurement also does is it likes to pretend that all decisions are much more rational and quantifiable than they really are. So I don't know if anybody's been in this position where you're given a balanced scorecard and you evaluate each pitching supplier according to 7 or 8 metrics on a weighted matrix. And of course, if you ask anybody, particularly after a couple of drinks, who's been through that process, you go, did you really do that? Did you actually add up the numbers and then decide who to give the business to? They go, did I bollocks? I decided who I wanted to win, and then I backfilled all the numbers to get the result I wanted, which is evidence that we don't make decisions the way that logical people like to think we make decisions.
Yeah, and in that respect, would you say in B2B procurement decision-making processes, is the team or is the individual more irrational? This question comes to us from William Wright.
I think what's really interesting, and if you look at, when I talk about defensive decision-making, this isn't some kind of marketing contrivance. Gerd Gigerenzer, who's a psychologist at the Max Planck Institute, and by the way, to the person who asked the healthcare question, does a considerable amount of work about decision-making in healthcare, where exactly the same defensive decision-making kicks in. It has really important, this avoidance of blame has really important implications for how we conduct business. because one, Gerd, when he spoke at Nudgestock a few years ago, said, if it weren't for defensive decision making, you could probably achieve the same level of economic output from businesses if we all went home Wednesday afternoon. Because around about at least 1.5 days of our week, and possibly more, are almost certainly spent not actually adding any value, but demonstrating rigor to avoid blame. So a huge amount of our apparently rigorous economic behavior. Someone else mentioned, I think from Latin America, that they worked with companies and all they really wanted the research to do was to provide them with air cover in the event that their decision came under attack. And I would argue that perhaps 50, 60% of market research, perhaps 25% of all business activity is really arse covering, which is disguised as rigor. So that's one really important point. The second point is that it creates enormous distortions in terms of, now, if you look at the extraordinarily high failure rate of large organizations in innovation compared to people who have none of their advantages, they're starting in a shed or a garage or something, and yet they manage to beat the incumbents. Zoom is an interesting case as a B2B company, which is when they went for investment, people said, hold on a second, guys. They said, you're up against, you're creating a product which you charge for, which will be competing in a mature sector with Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Apple, all of whom have pre-existing products in this space which are free. Do you seriously think there's a business opportunity there? You know, it's the B2B equivalent to Red Bull. It's apparently insane. And yet, because they actually got the psychology right around the product, they succeeded where the others had failed. But the fact that it's these small entities which are free to do, free to spend their time actually creating value rather than defending the decisions they've taken, I think is partly what gives innovators this extraordinary advantage. Yeah,
absolutely. That's brilliant. We have time for one last question, Rory.
Oh, two. Cram in two. I don't mind. Seriously.
Okay, fantastic. Well, this one comes to us from a member of the audience. What are the things that you wish you knew in your 20s when first starting out in your career?
Oh, well, the weird thing is when I started in my 20s, I knew about behavioral science because I worked in direct marketing. And what happened, I think, working in direct marketing was that you always used to, whenever you tested, you got findings in B2B as well, by the way, vitally, which were completely unexpected or rather inexplicable using conventional economic or logical terms or measures. And I always thought there was a missing science there. What I wish I'd done is spent a bit of time, of course, pre-internet, it was much harder discovering things of that kind. But I wished I'd discovered behavioral science when Amos Tversky was still kicking around and got the chance to meet him just once, I think. That might have been one of my regrets.
Is there a book in behavioral science or in a different discipline that has most influenced you?
Yeah, and this is a really important one. It's The Economic Naturalist, I think, by The Economic Naturalist, which is by Robert H. Frank, who's at Cornell, who applies, now I think that the mind of a biologist is a much better mindset to bring to business than the mind of an engineer. Because engineers are naturally reductionist, and biologists aren't. They accept complex systems with freak outcomes, butterfly effects, non-linearity, all the messiness of the biological world. Is a much better mindset to bring to understanding how business works than trying to pretend it's a machine. And so that was one book that was hugely influential. I'm also a big fan. A recent book's just come out by Matt Ridley called How Innovation Happens, which I'd also recommend because he argues that the process of innovation is, I don't think he goes far enough. I think he needs to give marketing more credit. But the process of innovation is not a scientist makes a discovery, everybody immediately discovers applications for it, and they all go laughing to the bank. It's actually an incredibly long and iterative process of experimentation, including the marketing challenge possibly being the biggest of all. Now, interestingly, if you look at Edison, okay, everybody thinks of Edison as an inventor. Everybody thinks of Jobs as a technologist. Both of them were, I mean, in Edison's case, to an almost repellent degree, but they were salesmen. They were kind of it was a huge kind of Barnum and Bailey business. That the light bulb wasn't just a question of, oh, light bulb, that's a lot better than gaslight, isn't it? Let me change my house over. It required years and years of persuasion. And one of the most fascinating things you can do if you want to rediscover your faith in marketing is go and dig back to the 1920s and 1930s and find sales manuals or advertisements for products that we now wouldn't dream of doing without. So go and find a sales manual explaining how to sell electricity to people. And you have all these objections they have to overcome. Now, if you moved into a house anywhere, even if you're a kind of doomsday prepper, right, you'd want some kind of electricity supply. But no, all of that, getting houses electrified, took a huge amount of actual marketing and salesmanship work.
Absolutely, and the consequences of not having that, those folks at this having a seat at the table, I think, are huge. And perhaps a really relevant example is
there's a lovely one from Ireland, persuading people to have electric kettles, and it's using. By the way, an interesting one, of course, to the Americans listening. That still hasn't worked in the United States, has it? You're still largely kettle free. How do you actually make tea and stuff? It must be like the bloody third world. But I mean, that's an interesting case where you had to actually give all these arguments why an electric kettle was better than the gas kettle. And it's fascinating because you go, I don't understand this copywriter. What the hell, where's he getting all this stuff from? And of course, it's reached a level of penetration now where we just assume it's the new normal. And if you wanted to disrupt the kettle, it would require a huge amount of work all over again.
It's so true. It's so true. And I think most true of all in the B2B sector. So thank you so much for all of your brilliant insights, both in this paper and also in this conversation. I hope that the members of the audience have taken away some actionable nuggets that they can apply to their work starting tomorrow. If there's one piece of advice that you'd like to leave our audience with, Rory, what would it be?
Yeah, I think what we've got to do is recalibrate our approach. So I'm glad you gave me a chance to say that. Recalibrate our approach to risk. And what we've got to do in business in general, not just in marketing, but particularly in marketing, is we've got to understand that there's always a trade-off between exploit and explore. That there's money. By the way, what I'm not suggesting is that businesses ignore everything they know and they reinvent everything every year, because that would be absolutely daft, okay? In the course of running a business, you learn things which are enduring truths, and you'd be crazy not to, exploit those findings. But there's got to be a separate budget, an entirely separate. I mean, if you look at how funny enough, people have just been mentioning Nespresso. If you look at how Nestle created Nespresso, they had to create this separate unit in a different town, at arm's length from head office, to get that innovation off the ground. And I think it only survived partly because Nespresso lied to Nestle for a couple of years about how successful they were being, so they didn't get killed. But I think we need to just be actually totally open with ourselves, that there is still a lot we don't know. There is still a lot that, however much data we have, won't provide us with the answers. And we have to understand there's a trade-off between exploit and explore, between effectively making good use of the things we already know, but also accepting that although when you experiment, it looks like a cost because of the way we're judging our exploit activities, we have to just accept it's not a cost, it's just the payback's different. So, for example, advertising, mass advertising, I mean, being famous using mass media. We know it works, okay? Broadly speaking, if you advertise quite a lot, it pays, okay? But you're not allowed to do that now because you can't explain how it works at the molecular level. Now, imagine a world where you weren't allowed to use drugs, which everybody knew worked, until everybody knew how they worked at the molecular level. Okay. Now, there are penicillin, antibiotics, for example, aspirin, paracetamol. There are about 10 or 15 drugs which have been used for decades simply because they had proven empirical effectiveness. Nobody knew how they worked, but they basically knew, one, they didn't kill you, and two, a lot of things got better when you took these things, okay? And we need the same level of permission in marketing to do things which we know work. The fact that they aren't actually, that not every single bit of of benefits is individually separable or quantifiable or attributable shouldn't prevent us from doing things that we know works.
Yeah, I think that that's a call to action if I've ever heard one. And I know that I speak not just for myself, but also so many members of the audience that we look forward to uncovering more of those enduring truths with you, and also with the support of this new report. So Rory, I'm going to toast to you, and I'm going
Likewise.
to on the call to download the Objectivity Trap to hear more from Rory.
Yes, can we share the link to the Objectivity Trap? I stupidly closed the window with it on.
Oh,
so if someone could share that in the chat thing, that'd be really super.
www.b2binstitute.org.
And bear in mind, the very fact that B2B marketing makes you overlooked is exactly why you have so much potential to make a difference. Because, you know, broadly speaking, you know, if there's a problem in Unilever, someone with a marketing mindset's probably had a look at it. Okay. If there's a problem in a B2B company, the likelihood is that no one who's looking at that problem, okay, has brought a marketing mindset to that at all, nor have they even thought of asking a marketer. So I think that the potential there to really, really be valuable is weirdly all the greater, precisely because it tends to be considered less important.
Exactly. And hopefully we've converted a few more folks to that perspective over the course of this keynote. So thank you, Rory. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great weekend. Stay safe.
Weekend.
Thanks, Kimberly. That's wonderful.
Take care.